Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next keynote on this Thursday afternoon, Creating Community-Centered and Equitable Fundraising Practices. This is such an important topic for all of us in the field, and we're really thrilled to have this very distinguished panel with us today, walking us through this important work. We have with us today Jill Kunishima, the VP of Development at Cityside, Andrea Faye Hart, Operations and Organizational Development Specialist at MLK 50, and Andrew Herrera, Director of Growth Strategy at City Bureau. The session was pre-recorded, so when it's finished, we'll go live to Jill, Andrea, and Andrew to continue the conversation and take your questions. In the meantime, if you want, please feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go and things occur to you as you listen to the recording. So thanks again to our panelists. Thanks for joining us, and let's move on over to our pre-recorded session.
Good afternoon. My name is Jill Kunishima, and I'm the VP of Development with Cityside. Thank you for joining us for this largely candid conversation on fundraising for news that centers community. We came together because we all work for nonprofit news organizations, MLK 50 of Memphis, City Bureau of Chicago, and Cityside in the Bay Area, and we are all taking a serious stance on what it means to be community-driven. We come from diverse backgrounds and have varied professional experiences, but at the end of the day, we are all charged with raising funds to make this work happen. Thinking through how fund development can stay in alignment with organizational values, especially around diversity and equity in relation to community, is how most of us spend our days. And we all have a lot of thoughts about this work. But let's start off with some introductions. So Andrea, can you tell us who you are, what brought you to this work, and a little bit about your organization?
Sure. Thank you, Jill, for kicking us off. So hi, I'm Andrea Faye Hart. I am originally from Chicago. I am currently in Nashville pursuing a chaplaincy degree at Vanderbilt Divinity School, also known as the Lesbian Seminary of the South. Do with that information what you will. I sort of fell into fundraising, thinking about this conversation. I was like, what is my origin story of fundraising? So I was a media-based organizer working with young people in Chicago, and I was doing direct service work and ultimately just wanted to get grants so that the young people could tell stories how they wanted to tell them and with dope gear. That was really my motivation. So I've and that was over 10 years ago. And so I've sort of straddled this line of doing engagement and programming and development work ever since. Formerly of City Bureau, currently at MLK 50 based in Memphis, and also the board co-chair of Scalawag based in Durham, both organizations in the South, where I basically support and am in service of two missions that center community, talk about anti-oppression work through their reporting. And I'll get into more details on those things. But yeah, in both organizations, working with Black women-led organizations to try to both unapologetically be community-centered on the philanthropy side, in addition to on the reporting side. So that's my quick overview.
Andrew, you're next.
All right, thanks, guys. So yeah, my name is Andrew Herrera. I'm the Director of Network Growth at City Bureau, where I oversee both marketing efforts as well as our individual fundraising efforts. For those of you who are unfamiliar, City Bureau is a journalism lab dedicated to reimagining the role of local media, the role local media can play in supporting community and our collective pursuit of self-liberation. And what brought me to this work is, I come from a kind of non-traditional background, both in terms of movement organizing at the community level on the Lower West Side of Chicago, and through corporate public relations, which is just a world away, where I worked with a lot of global consumer brands. And with that, that background informs my respect for the power of communication and moving people by connecting language to emotion, and really making anything possible. And I also developed a firm belief that community-based action is the only stable base to really build change from. So I try to bring both of those beliefs and the experiences from both those sorts of professional backgrounds to this work. And this work, I do believe, is more important than ever right now, because the world is fragmenting in lots of different ways, and people are increasingly stressed by forces they can't see. So really having robust and healthy information networks is super important, and the role of the media is really key to being able to grow and maintain those. And at the same time, as the need is greater than ever, media has been dying for the past generation, and we're really hitting kind of a crisis point here. And so that's something that really inspires me about the mission that we are all collectively engaged in terms of reimagining, again, the role of the media, reimagining what it takes to build a sustainable community-based media, and thinking about, how does that impact people positively now in the present, and how does that set us up for a brighter future, full of hope and opportunity. So that's me.
Great. And as I mentioned, my name's Jill Kunishima, and I'm the VP of Development at Cityside, which is a less than 2-year-old nonprofit news organization based in the Berkeley, Oakland area. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan media organization, and we are committed to building community through our local journalism. We hope to provide our readers with fact-driven and informative reporting that really seeks out the diversity and complexity of our communities. And even though they're right next to each other, they are very diverse communities. We currently have 2 newsrooms. One is called the Berkeley side, and the other one's called the Oakland side. And my origin story, I've been fundraising for about 15 years. I had a quick stint in marketing. I was a teacher for a little bit, and I actually studied journalism in my undergrad work. But I fell into fundraising, much like Andrea said, out of passion for a lot of different things. I've fundraised for homelessness issues. I've fundraised for services around at-risk youth. I've fundraised to provide scholarships for community college students, civil rights advocacy. But one of the main reasons that I fundraise is because being able to raise time, talent, and treasure for causes that matter, I believe helps to repair some of the damage that has been inflicted in so many of our underserved communities. But I'm currently focused on journalism in this moment in time because, and I think Andrew spoke to this a little bit, but I believe we're on the cusp of something better or perhaps complete demise. Without facts, without balanced information, without context, there's just no chance for any type of progress here. So I believe journalism offers us an opportunity to put important information out there, as well as create dialogue, which I think is sorely missing right now. And frankly, disrupt the status quo that doesn't seem to be working out well for just about anyone. So it's one tool, but I think it's a really critical one for any type of progress we hope to see. So I'm going to dive right into one of our big questions. And I don't think there's any right answer for this. And I think that every person has a different take on this. But I think it's at the heart of what we've all been talking about, which is, what does it mean to be community-centered? Why does it matter that we're here? I think a lot of people say that they're community-centered. So how do you define that? And how do you know you're doing it? Because I'll be frank that I think that this is like a nut to crack. It's intangible, it's unquantifiable, and oftentimes confused. So Andrew, would you be willing to take on this juicy question?
Sure thing. I think being community-centered just means being in dialogue with your community, being anchored in your community, and being accountable to your community. And I think that accountability really is key. Because a lot of times you'll see organizations start, all kinds of organizations, both in the journalism space and other places, where they start as community organizations, actually, created by members of the community in response to a specific community issue, and then they get co-opted. And they stop being responsive to the community, but they maintain the veneer of a community organization. And that can be really pernicious because that actually undermines people's faith in their local institutions, and makes it much more difficult for other folks who are trying to build something positive and to actually get that kind of traction, that public trust. For community news organizations, it's really, really imperative that that folks really take the time to invest in the community and those relationships. And that's another thing I'll stress is it's relational, right? And just like any other relationship, you have to invest time into it, you have to maintain it, and trust is paramount. And so if you make a commitment, you have to be prepared to follow through on that commitment over time. And you have to be able to show up over and over again, and show up in the community spaces where people are, so you can be seen and you can hear what they actually have to say. And you have to honor people by taking what you've heard and putting it into action, repeating it back, making it clear that you've not just heard, but you've listened. And so, I think this is a direction that fundraising has, and journalism has actually moved significantly in this direction over the past few years. I don't want to take up too much time here. But I think that I've kind of covered most of the points. But I think that the last key point I would say here is that we as people who work for these kinds of organizations need to be very clear with ourselves and with our teams and with our stakeholders that we are not martyrs. We are not sacrificing ourselves for the good of others, that we are actually in community with others, and their well-being and their good fortune is our good fortune and our well-being. And so if we can see our needs as aligned, and we can see that we are mutually dependent upon each other, then I think that creates a kind of clarity where you have that accountability. You have that accountability to yourself, you have that accountability to the community, and you remain in conversation and in community with people that you're serving, you're working for. So I hope that answers the question.
Well, I just threw that big one at you, so you did great. But I think, like you touched on a lot of things I think are really important here. And one of the things that I was thinking about with this question was like, oh man, I'm like going into like grant speak mode. It's like, how are you fulfilling the needs of your community? And it's so easy to kind of go to those like obvious answers, right? Like, oh, we're listening to our community. We're going to acknowledge what we've done wrong, and we're engaging in two-way dialogue and feedback loops, which I think are all extremely important. But that's so input driven, it's still so focused, I feel like, on the organization. And what I really want to see, and I do think it kind of goes into that vague space that does make this hard, but ultimately, like, this is about impact, right? Like, this is about impacting our communities. So when your community can honestly say that they are able to live a better life because of what you provide, that they have greater agency and are more civically engaged because of what you provide, that they feel less isolated and more connected to the places we call home because of what we provide, I would argue that that's when you're really in service of community. What do you think, Andrea?
No, I agree. I think some of what you guys are bringing up makes me think about the difference between community versus audience, and just being really explicit about that. So like at MLK 50, community-centered news looks like centering the experiences of those that Martin Luther King Jr. died fighting for in Memphis, and those that Ida B. Wells fought for that got her pushed out of Memphis. And then for Scalawag, it's a more blanket statement about the South and those communities that are experiencing oppression. And I think that there are to Andrew's point, like specific ways that we think about what it means to serve those folks. And then there's sort of this larger audience that may not be necessarily place-based, but may be championing what we are doing. So in both situations, these are organizations that are in environments where, how do I put this nicely? Political environments that are a bit hostile on a lot of levels, including philanthropically, even like locally. So thinking about I think one of the things as an organization is being really mindful about those two distinctions so that you can have sort of a North Star, some community agreements within your organization about who is our audience and how are we engaging them. That includes those on the fundraising side, so that those on the community-based side can keep doing that work and not feeling any sort of tension or that they're caught in this trap where they're no longer fulfilling the needs of the community, if that makes sense. And then I think to some of what Andrew was saying, some of it is, disrupting, getting to a point where you can disrupt the status quo with your community, not just for them. So in both instances, like, and for MLK 50, it's been, yes, we've like had millions of dollars of debt forgiveness around an abusive sort of hospital collection practice in Memphis. But, being able to bring people into the fold during COVID to like get paid to tell their stories about surviving COVID, like that was really important. And then on the Scalawag end, having an entire week of an abolitionist week, to like centering in those practices and trying to share those practices with one another, then also informs the reporting that we're doing in the long run. And so those are things that we would do with the community, but that's not necessarily something we would do with the audience, if that makes sense. Yeah, that was just sort of, I was thinking about that, hearing Andrew speak and then hearing you speak, Jill.
Yeah, and if I could piggyback on that quickly, I think one of the things that's coming up here is that to be community centered, like you were saying, Andrea, it means more than being in service of community. It means being in relationship with, being in community with community, right? And
yeah.
And so a big part of that is that it has to stretch to all parts of the organization. It can't just be about, for a media organization, for instance, not just the stories that we write, right? And like we're polling people, right? We're getting that feedback loop. It means that we're actually hiring people from the community. And it means that we are inviting people into the process and creating the means by which people can feel a sense of ownership over the work and know that we're doing this again in community with each other. And I think that's what it means to be community centered, is that the only way you stay centered is by having those people from whatever community you're a part of, whether it's a place-based community or some other kind of community that exists. Those people are in that organization helping steer the ship, so to speak. So I think that's really key, and I think that's something that the CNO model has actually made more possible for a lot of organizations, because if you were a massive publishing group, being place-based is kind of just bopping reporters all around the country and relocating them. And now these organizations are able to actually recruit locally, for both the reporters and their operations teams and all that kind of stuff.
Right. And I think that's a great segue to another big question around like your approach to fundraising, which I don't think you can separate from what you were just talking about, Andrew. It's like how your organization operates, how your fundraising operates is one and the same, right? So I think we want to try to answer this question. And, again, this is going to be different for every one of us, but what's your approach to fundraising and how can we be more equitable in it? Who wants to start this time? I picked on both of you, so I could also offer myself up, I guess. It's only fair. It's only equitable. So I know this is like this is something that really gets to me. But I actually think that before we even start talking about our organizations and fundraising, we need to start with a conversation about how we even bring people into this work. And specifically, I'm going to talk about like how we hire and how we recruit. And I am someone who's been in fundraising for a long time. And so I've applied to 100+ jobs at this point. And I cannot tell you how many times I've become one of the finalists for a position only to be told, we loved you, but we wish you had more major donor experience. Now, I would say in like the first decade or so of my career, I would just take it. I would just like accept it as fact. Like, okay, yeah, I need more major gift experience. And And my imposter syndrome saddled self was just like, okay, let's move on to the next. But at some point I started asking for clarification, so how much major donor experience? Are we talking about volume? Are we talking about dollar amount? And how do you define major anyway? And shockingly, a lot of organizations could not answer the question. But in return, they kind of answered a question for me, which is that I don't want to work for an organization that cannot answer that question, And this is one example, but I think issues of equity show up in how we write our job descriptions, how we think about staffing, what we demand of our applicants educationally, experientially, how we interview. And I don't think we can even talk about community without talking about this aspect of our work. Because who we are ultimately is how we show up. It's how we build relationships. It's obviously how we fundraise. So to say something like a lack of major gift experience is why I'm being turned down for a job without explanation it's just unfair. It's prejudiced. And frankly, some of the best fundraisers I've ever hired had no fundraising experience. Some of them were bartenders. Some of them came out of the tech sector. Some of them were basically students, coming out of college who had like the grit and the wherewithal to make things happen. So I think we all need to take like a good hard look at this. And I think bringing in people that look and feel like is just the easy way to go. And we can all say that, it doesn't really matter what we look like. It's easier to hire someone that feels comfortable to you. But at the end of the day, if you don't have a diversity of people in your organization, if you don't have a diversity of people doing your fund development, you won't have much diversity in your donor pool or your funder pool either. And when we look at the demographic shifts of this country, we know everything is shifting, right? So I guess the question is like, will your organization make it through without really thinking about this? I think if you just look around your room, the answer will emerge. Okay, that was too much, but I get real heated about this, obviously. So I'm gonna popcorn to someone who wants to go on to, it doesn't have to be about hiring, obviously, but like going back to what I originally asked about, like your approach to fundraising. I'd love to hear someone else.
I'm down to go. I just want to plus one. I appreciate you. I think lots of people think about nonprofit newsrooms and are like, the mission is very external, but what you named is like why missions are also internal, that it's also about how you treat people. So I appreciate you naming that and uplifting that, because I think it is something we don't talk about and assume everybody is doing. And it's a dangerous assumption. Yeah, so I think thinking, also reflecting to prepare for this conversation, I realized that most of my most recent experience has been with organizations that are in startup mode. So like from City Bureau to MLK 50 to Scalawag. And so some of what I'm going to speak to is really specific to that. I think all three of those organizations, like, and thinking specifically about MLK 50 and Scalawag, these are organizations that have they're very explicit about their mission. And so I think to that extent, it's baked in a lot of the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, or if you hate that term as much as I do, like whatever that looks like for you. I think, so those principles are kind of there. And so what we've sort of had to determine in both organizations is like, what is the sustainable path forward for us? And how are we not trying to repeat some of the trauma from traditional fundraising for newsrooms, especially thinking about Wendy. Wendy was a veteran columnist at a daily paper in Memphis and was pushed out for her views and perspectives. So really thinking about how are we creating a strategy that doesn't put us back into that cycle, and then one that also allows us to fulfill our mission so that we can equip those that we're serving to do good trouble, as the Representative John Lewis used to say. So that's kind of the approach is less about whether or not, like, we want to provide that information for people to do the radical things. I don't know that I don't think either organization necessarily believes that journalism itself is radical. At Scalawag, it's more, Scalawag is explicitly a liberatory organization that uses journalism as one of its tools. So just sort of naming that distinction in some of the ways that they frame what they're doing. And so thinking about both organizations, and both organizations being where they are in the South and some of the local philanthropy there, our approach has tended to be seeking outside of journalism, actually, for funding, identifying foundation partners such as Cerna Foundation or the Andrew Mellon Foundation, who understand whether it's a social justice level or a humanities level, the work that we're doing, and can provide general operating support. So explicitly trying to apply for general operating support so that that can give us somewhat of a runway, so we are not pigeonholed to projects and required to do a lot of deliverables that are ultimately really problematic and more in service of the foundation than the community we're serving, I should say. So that's been like one approach, has been one, looking outside of journalism for foundation partners that are much more values aligned and can provide general operating support. And then from there, identifying additional pathways for those who are fans, like in our audience, that want us to succeed because they are tired of misinformation in a state like Tennessee, or they're tired of sort of some of the corruptness that's happened in North Carolina. Finding those aligned folks, but once again, I think even in those sort of major gift folks, really sussing them out and having a good internal compass that's like, is this person asking much of us, or are they just asking us to still do? We have a major donor at MLK 50 who's like a gift. She literally knows her lane, and she doesn't ask us for more than just keep doing the reporting. So finding those folks, yeah. So our approach is more of like, okay, how do we do harm reductive fundraising so that the information we're putting out there lets our audience do the really radical things to really transform locally what's happening in Memphis, and then what's happening in the various communities that Scalawag serves. I don't know if that actually fully answered your question, Jill, but I tried.
It's a big question, and we could all talk all day about it, I think, but it's all you, Andrew.
Yeah, you guys have brought up, I think it is a big question. There's a lot of different ways to answer this. So I want to respond to a few things and introduce a couple new ideas and try to do it very quickly. But I agree completely with Andrea's point of looking outside of journalism. I think that one of the blessings of this cursed moment that we're in is that the industry of journalism has fallen so far that people are now beginning to reevaluate what it means, right? And what needs it meets, and what the point of it is. And so once you start kind of going back to the fundamentals there, you start thinking about it, you realize that journalism is in service of information systems, right? The social information systems. And how are we connecting people with the information that they need to make sense of their world, to be able to act, with agency in that world. And that creates the opportunity for a lot of connection points, like Andrea was saying, between democracy foundations and civil rights foundations and all other kinds of foundations that are trying to do work, because a lot of these foundations also need, they rely on the other things that they're supporting. So maybe it's affordable housing, or maybe it's access to clean drinking water, or maybe it's food security, or maybe it's infant mortality. All of those things require people to know about the resources that exist. And so without the work that we do, you can't get anything else done. So what that does is it creates this opportunity, right, to tell a different kind of story around journalism and its importance in the here and now. So that's definitely, in terms of our approach to fundraising, that's a key component, particularly in the foundation direction. But like I mentioned at the top of this, my scope of work really is around individual giving. And coming from a movement organizing background, I have a lot of experience asking folks for small dollar donations and to support independent candidates and all that kind of work. And one of the big tensions that I find when talking to colleagues in this space is that, well, what's the point of going out and asking for money if you hire, it's to run your development team, right? You're sinking 100 grand, let's just say, to throw an easy number out there. You're sinking 100 grand into staff salaries, into resources, into tools, into whatever, just to get started. So how many individual donations does it take to make that up, right? When we could just be going out and getting money from foundations. And the kind of response to that that I very firmly believe in, and that we're pursuing at City Bureau, is that the act of donating is more than just giving money. The act of donating is an act of investment in your community. It's something that you believe in, and it's something that makes you feel a sense of ownership over the movement, the organization, a sense of, to move away from market language, a sense of participation, to be a participatory member of your community and something that you believe is actually helping to save your community or to benefit your community, to give back to your community. And so that's what we really focus on when it comes to, particularly how we message around individual donating, because you need time to build out an infrastructure. Talk about, a lot of development folks will put out stats that 80% of money donated in any given year comes from small dollar donors, but that comes from massive organizations with huge teams, with endowments, with 40 years in the market, and everybody knows about them. And so for our small community organizations, particularly community organizations that are based in communities of color or communities that have been historically disenfranchised, we need time to be able to build up that base of support, and we need time to be able to integrate ourselves into the community and to become a trusted pillar of the community. And so, the foundation side of things helps us get that time. And at the same time, building that community of support around our work, building those moments for inclusion and finding different ways to help people participate is really key to making it sustainable over time. So I did ramble more than I meant to. I apologize.
Okay, I think it's a great way to wrap this up, because fundraising is one tool that sits within one tool that we're talking about right now, but it's a little bit of a microcosm, I think what we're dealing with on our day-to-days of much bigger questions and issues we're all facing. So I think we literally have a minute left. I wanted us to have some takeaways, but I think, Andrea mentioned Ida B. Wells, and I'm just going to leave us with a quote that I think is a fantastic one. And I might have actually learned it from MLK 50 initially. And it's that the people must know before they can act, and there's no educator to compare with the press. And I think that that's a really encouraging part of what we do, even though we live in really hard times. So thank you for joining us for this conversation, and we open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really a terrific presentation. And neither of you, I think, Andrew, you said it last, but maybe everybody said it. None of you rambled on at all. It was really terrific. And I hope folks will throw questions in the chat or just raise their hand and jump right in and start talking. But some things came up for me as you were going through your presentations, and I'm just going to jump right in if that's okay, and get it going. I think you all have been responsible for launching really successful community-based fundraising, equitable fundraising programs from scratch, right? And Andrea, you talked about how it takes time, to build up what to be able to connect with community, to build your place there, to build your relationships there, and enough of a runway for fundraising. And I know lots of organizations have that challenge, like how long of a runway is it, and how do you keep the organization moving forward and sustained while you're trying to build and build and build the momentum. Can any of you talk a little bit about how you got started? Sort of, you walked in on your first day and saw what you had and saw what you wanted to accomplish. And what did you think about? And what did you think was the first thing you should start focusing on? And how long did it take you really before you started to feel some momentum?
Well, I'm very interested to hear from Andrea, because Andrea is, of course, one of the co-founders of City Bureau. So I came in right as she left. And, from where I'm standing, I came in, City Bureau is about 4.5 years old. Because we just celebrated 6 years now. So I did the math. I've been there for 25% of City Bureau's life. And the first thing was that was seeing what had gone right. Like what were the strengths of the organization. And one of the greatest strengths of the organization is that there is a great community of practice around City Bureau. And there's a lot of people who are really, really enthusiastic about the work the City Bureau does. And Chicago is a special place for media. There's a lot of folks who are very interested in supporting media, and there's a big independent media environment in Chicago. And so, the first thing we did was really lean into that, and we had a 5th anniversary campaign last year, where everything was revolved around thanking everybody who had made that work possible. And that drew a really positive response, because it did emphasize the role that the City Bureau didn't grow in isolation, right? City Bureau grew in a garden that has been cultivated by generations of people doing this work. And acknowledging that and thanking people for those contributions and providing new ways for people to contribute to the future and sustained growth of the organization was something that resonated with a lot of people, and led to a very successful end of year campaign that was really relational. Invited people to donate, but then to also take a step into a deeper relationship with the organization as we transitioned from what we'd been, which is like a scrappy neighborhood group, to a local institution, which is what we're still striving to become. So yeah.
Just to reiterate the question, I want to make sure I heard it right. It was essentially the day one of starting something, or is it sort of like just your day-to-day, how you approach your day-to-day early on?
Well, how you approach your day-to-day would be fascinating and wonderful to learn from as well. I was thinking about when you all launched what you launched. How did you start? What did you think about? How did you put your priorities in place to meet the needs of community and get the resources that you needed?
No, okay, I appreciate that framing. I know Wendy's on here, so I know she's trying to hide, because I may ping her, but so contextually, just like Chicago and Memphis, as much as they feel like sister cities, are so wildly different philanthropically. Like, I think in Chicago, having had experiences that each of the co-founders had, like, we sort of knew what was possible and what avenues and who to approach, and explicitly around general operating funds, like being unapologetic about, we're not going to have you fund programs, you are going to support general operating, because we need to support the people doing this work. So I think that was like the initial, because then it freed us up to be really clearly hearing community and work with community, and not get in the mess of, which I've been in situations where this has happened, where like you do the shiny new thing, the programs that people love, and then you're caught in that trap and you can't walk out, to quote Elvis. But then I think, so I guess this is how I'm going to pivot to Memphis, is then thinking about Memphis, just how much it's politics in the state of Tennessee and then in Memphis are wildly different, and being really, and Wendy is brilliant at being, I'm going to just shine Wendy a million times over every day, all day, understanding that like the pathway there was doing incredible reporting that was unapologetic about the mission, and you couldn't look away. And that is a different approach, because I think the foundation is different. Like the assumption in the community in Chicago is very different around some of the words you can use and what you can say versus Memphis. And so I think part of it is figuring out what is your initial tool today versus what is your tool 6 months, 5 years from now? And are you having relationships with, and to Teresa's question, which I loved in the comments, some folks, some foundations, some funders, you will be able to build a relationship over time where you can talk about equitable practices. And some you won't, because you have to kind of save yourself and save your energy. Like, you just have to realize, like, sometimes that money is not worth it. It's not worth having to train a funder, because it's above your pay grade or whatever. So I appreciate, it's like, I think some of it has been figuring out what lane and how to develop relationships and when to return to them and when you cannot, to sort of answer Teresa's question and that initial question. And then I'm going to stop talking.
Yeah, I think some fundraising is too expensive. It's like it's costing you something that you should never give up. And I think there is this notion that we bend to our funders, and for good reason, that idea exists in our heads, and is very prevalent in a lot of ways. But I really believe that, for our funders to deliver on their missions, we need to be in alignment. And that sometimes means saying no to certain types of funds. Some funds are just not going to be worth it. They do not uphold the community you're trying to uphold. They do not uphold the values you're trying to uphold. And that's something, the whole organization should be crystal clear on.
Value aligned, for sure. Have you guys seen that starting to change? Have you found more foundations and funders that are value aligned and trying to learn about this important work in new ways?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's been a shift in philanthropy overall, where people are starting to see the importance of the back end. I think like 20 years ago or whatever it was, there's a real shift in overhead being waste. And now we're realizing, and I think particularly in this space, in the CNO space, there's an understanding that, journalists can't be the only ones at a media organization. And they've never been the only ones in a media organization. And so why would a CNO be any different? And particularly when you start thinking about how are we engaging community, you need different kinds of specialists, folks who are mapping out community relationships and maintaining relationships to local organizations and all that kind of work. And I think this leads it really interestingly into the question that I hope I'm not butchering this pronunciation, but Uyosa asked about if the individuals who make up our story, the story sharing organizers, impacted individuals, et cetera, participate in the fundraising side of things, and if so, how, and if not, why. So just kind of, I think that's a really important question to ask. And I think that it's so critical for, I'm a big believer that the only true liberation is self-liberation. And that we all have to participate in building the means to that liberation, because power seeds nothing without a demand. I'm just like quote here, but I think the critical thing though is that I think a distributed approach to fundraising is something that we've seen really revolutionize politics in the past 8 years. With Act Blue and all these small dollar donations really shifting races across the country. And I think it's really important, and there's a democratizing effect to that. But I think that is the most difficult thing to achieve, because you have to be able to drive a deep, deep faith in what you're doing. And you have to be able to communicate that broadly. And you have to practice real movement building. And so talking about that long runway, it takes time to build that faith, and it takes, an intentionality to continue having that conversation and to invite people to participate in that way. And then the last thing I'll say is that it's very sticky also, because you start running into this question of, well, there's billions of dollars out there. Why am I asking somebody who's making $18,000 a year to donate $5 a month to participate? Why should they be the ones that are funding this? All the people who broke the system, they should be the ones that fund it. That's a very valid point. And I think that's a question that we all have to tussle with. And the way that we approach it at City Bureau is by making sure that we value all kinds of contributions the same. So you contribute your time, you contribute your resources, you contribute your abilities. That is valued the same as if you contribute, $5 or $100 or $10,000. And I think that to both message that and then to really internalize that, to make sure everybody on staff understands that and believes that, and is always repeating that back, is a way of respecting the community and inviting that kind of participation that opens the door for that kind of distributed approach to fundraising.
And also participation, depending on who you're working with. Like if you're truly trying to involve your community, volunteering of that time and energy for someone means a different thing to different groups of people. So I'll use Oakland Side as an example. They launched this community advisor team this year to solicit feedback from the community. And we compensated them because we knew that not everyone there had the same bandwidth, the same finances to be able to give that time, but we valued that, what they were putting into what we did. And that meant we needed to compensate them in some way. So sometimes it requires something like that. And just really thinking about what is a contribution, like Andrew was saying, there are very different types of contributions and we need all of them to do our work in a community-driven way.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to speak to both questions as well, the shift in funding and then the individual question. Currently at MLK 50, that's not, because we are trying to really understand the model of our work. Like, what does it look like to do engagement, equitable, investigative journalism locally, and sustain sort of an ecosystem around it? Because I think a lot of investigative journalism funding is still caught up in either funding the big national folks or just funding individuals. And so I think we want to really be mindful, thinking about who our namesake died serving in Memphis, being really mindful about if folks are going to contribute that we are directly serving in this low wealth community, we better be damn sure that we're providing a benefit to them immediately. So I think that's like sort of where we're at on that question. And then in terms of the other questioning about funding, so thinking back to 2016, which was not that long ago, but feels really long. I think fundamentally there was a shift in Chicago philanthropy when Trump got elected. It opened the door for a city bureau to be possible. I think because I think a lot about white guilt, not just because I'm in seminary, which is where I'm sitting right now, but I think about it even in a moving money context. So I want to name that in terms of like what I saw then. And I think some of the gaps I still see in philanthropy is I still see philanthropic support really still emphasizing big cities and not really considering those areas that at that time were called flyover country, or like we only elevate areas like Tennessee or like places like the South when we want to say bad things about them. I know Alicia Bell's on this conversation and she will plus one that, thinking about North Carolina. But yeah, and so I think philanthropy still has a way to go, not just thinking about equity, but regionally, thinking about regions and thinking about the intersection of like geography and class and where you are and where you're supporting. And like, I think there was a shift, and I think there can be a bigger shift. I think there needs to be a more nuanced approach. Like I was happy to see what happened in 2016, obviously because City Bureau benefited from it. But now being here and working at the organizations I'm working at, I'm sort of like, how do we move it further? And I would like it not to take another election of who for it to happen. So.
I think that brings up a lot of interesting points, and particularly bringing in a national context, Andrea, and just kind of how it was a deeply traumatic thing for a lot of people that Trump got elected. It felt like an impossibility. And I remember, because of the political work that I've done, I'm like the political guy that a lot of people in my social circles know. And so my phone was blowing up for like 3 days. People were like, what do we do now? And at work the next day, like there are a lot of people crying. And I think there's this thing about privilege where you feel like the world can't touch you. And then all of a sudden, something that you think is impossible happens, and that shatters or at least cracks that illusion, right? And it creates a moment where people start paying attention to the fundamentals, like how did this happen, right? And I think there's a lot of really problematic narratives that have come about how it happened. Oh, it was Facebook. you know, there's Mark Zuckerberg left the button unattended and somebody pushed it, and now all of a sudden we have Trump. You know, it's a ridiculous argument. And so, you know, of course, the truth is much more complicated. And tying this in with Steve's question about the best way that national nonprofit journalism shops can support our fundraising work, you know, I think there's a lot of different ways to answer that question, but it reminds me of the fact that this crisis in media has not affected everybody similarly, right? CNN really benefited from Trump being elected, and so did Fox News, and now we have ONA or OAN, and whatever, you know, the news station, the far right one. My point here is that we have these different kind of foci nationally of where public attention is going, and partly that's to do with the monopolies that control the cables, right, of how people actually receive information. And so but the counterpoint to that, and I'll tighten it up here, is that news production still happens at the local level, and everybody knows that. And so the less and less local publications that we have, the less quality information that we have, because CNN is just putting talking heads up there and they don't care what they talk about. And so we have to be able to work together collaboratively, because like Andrea is saying, there is this investigative journalism, right, that doesn't have an immediate impact. It might take 6 months or a year or 5 years or 10 years for a story to really bear fruit. And we have these big national stories where you have, you know, things that are being intertwined, but we have the daily reporting on the ground, and we have the going to the meetings, and we have, you know, listening to people's stories and hearing people's truths. That needs to happen in every single community across the country, including the flyover country, you know, or rural areas and all these other places. And so I think that we need to be able to act in our own industry in solidarity with each other and understand our own fates as intertwined, particularly for those of us who care about, you know, the journalism that I fell in love with when I was a little kid, right? Which is that, you know, this dogged search for the truth, you know, the truth shall prevail, and all those kinds of things. The best that journalism can be. And I think that most of us here, if not all of us here, believe in that version of journalism, and that version of journalism takes all of us working together to be able to share those stories and to be able to share that information so it gets where it needs to go for people to make, you know, decisions that benefit their lives.
Jill, you talked a little bit at the very beginning of the session about finding development professionals, bartenders, whoever with great skills and great ability to take this on, you know, and how important it is that organizations sort of change their hiring practices and change how they think about who can do this job and why they're doing this job, and what it means to get into this work. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how, you know, I work for a big funder that also owns a big local, you know, legacy or traditional newspaper. How should someone like I think differently about who we hire to do fundraising for the Lenfest Institute?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just one of the most important personal learnings of my own to see who thrives in settings like this. And on a very, you know, practical note, I think one of the best ways to think about it is to have a varied group of people think about what are the competencies that we value in fundraising, as opposed to the like, you know, things like what degrees we have, you know, how many however many years we've been doing this kind of week, how much money we've even raised in our careers, but to boil it down to like, what are these characteristics of people that do really well in fundraising? And I like to use the example of the bartender, because I think of someone like AOC, who, you know, she was a bartender, right? And now, you know, she's, whatever your political views are, you know, she is kicking butt doing what she does in New York. But she has talked about like the skills she gained from being a bartender and being behind a counter. And I feel very similarly about what it takes to do this work. You know, people who are resourceful, people who are just dogged, like no matter what their job was, you know, like we need those kind of people in this field. We need people who can be so creative. But at the end of the day, I think it's boiling things down to competencies over those typical boxes that you see on a resume. I think it can also be really helpful to do some auditing of your own job descriptions. In my former role, I was also a director of development at a affordable housing organization previous to Cityside, and we went through this painstaking process of auditing 140 job descriptions at that organization. And it was enlightening on many notes. Part of it was just that we were clearly thinking about our jobs in very different ways. It varied from like department to department, but we were also using different language. We were balancing out things in different ways, and that's just not fair, right? It's not fair in thinking about like who will eventually come into this organization and hopefully lead this organization. So doing an audit process with a very diverse group of people was really helpful in rethinking who can do this work well.
It'll be so
Yep.
interesting. Oh, sorry, Andrew.
Well, if I could just piggyback on that a little bit, one of the things that we do through our hiring process at City Bureau that I had, like when I was hired, I had never encountered before, was a case exercise. And so we actually, for each position, it's just kind of like a practical, show us how you would approach a real world situation. And that's just so, it seems like such a basic thing, but we've heard again and again, how fun actually our application process is. And people really enjoy going through it, and we pay them for it too, which I think is very important, to honor people's time and work. And it's really interesting because it forces us to basically, when you get those ones, and we're going through a bunch of hirings right now, so this is very top of mind, but when you get those folks who are kind of on the margin, you're like, they were great, but the resume is like not relevant. You don't want to roll the dice on them, but then because you have to work with them, so if it's a hire that doesn't work out, then it's like, oh, now my job's a lot harder. But then you get the case exercise and wow, they're brilliant. Like I wouldn't have expected it, right? And you get to prove your assumptions wrong. So I think it is that it's balancing, making sure that you're checking your own assumptions and you're creating the processes that are necessary to be able to effectively check those assumptions and create the confidence that you need to be able to make that kind of important consequential decision for your organization.
It sounds like a really amazing exercise. I've never heard of that before. And I can't imagine you would not learn a tremendous amount about the people you're talking to and working with and partnering with going through that process.
Yeah, it's fun. And you get to be creative with it too, which is nice.
One day, like higher ed major gift officers are evaluated based on how many calls they make. It has nothing to do with building community necessarily or engaging. It'll be interesting to see how long it will take for, big dyed-in-the-wool institutions who've done things their own way for a million years start to really change the paradigm, shift the paradigm a bit. I was fascinated by Mario Lugai's presentation today about development officers being agents of social change, and that when you connect with community and with donors, you're actually helping them to engage in a really important body of work, not just making a gift to support the work. And I think it's a really important way of looking at the work and different for a lot of us. And so you all and others stand out as role models for doing it really well and leading the way. So thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for today's session. I hope we captured all of the questions and all of the things you wanted to say. I want to be mindful of the time since it's 5 o'clock Eastern, but we're very glad to have you here. Thank you for giving the time to do this. We really appreciate it. And we appreciate everybody who came to this session and to the summit overall. We sent out a very short fundraising poll about how much people are raising. We tried to keep it really simple and not complicated and convoluted at all, just so we can get a sense of where we are now and where we may be as an industry 5 years from now. And we'll kick off, so please remember to fill that out and send it back. It'll be helpful to us. And we hope you all will join us tomorrow morning at 11 Eastern time. We'll kick off our final day with a conversation with Jim Brady, the newly appointed VP of Journalism at the Knight Foundation. So hope to see you all then. And thank you again for a really wonderful session today. Really appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.